The lone cowboy is a Hollywood legend, but the history tells a very different story. From blockbuster films to dime novels, the cowboy has been defined by independence. The Marlboro Man rides solo across endless plains. John Wayne faces down outlaws without backup. Clint Eastwood squints through desert heat, trusting no one but himself. It's a beautiful story, but it's almost completely false. But before we get into the video, please make sure to hit that sub button. First, let me paint you the real picture. Y'all, a typical cattle drive required between 12 and 15 men to manage 2,500 head of cattle across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Every single position was a matter of life and death, and abandoning your crew meant abandoning your own survival. The mathematics were brutal and simple. One man alone on the range was a dead man. Whether it was a stampede that could crush you in seconds, rustlers who would kill you for your cattle, or simply getting lost in territory so vast it could swallow you without a trace. Isolation was a death sentence. The real American cowboy was part of what historians now recognize as one of the most diverse workforces in 19th century America. These men didn't work alone because they couldn't work alone. The cattle industry was built on specialized teamwork that would make a modern corporate structure look simple. Here's what Hollywood won't tell you. The average cowboy made $30 a month, barely enough to survive. They weren't rugged individualists pursuing freedom. They were working-class laborers whose survival depended entirely on the crew around them. Remove any piece of that crew, and the entire operation could collapse, taking everyone's lives with it. We'll come back to that, but first, you need to understand just how organized these operations really were. A cattle drive wasn't a casual journey. It was a military-style operation with rigid hierarchy and specialized roles. The trail boss held absolute authority, like the captain of a ship, because democratic decision-making could get everyone killed. Below him, every position had a specific function that kept the entire crew alive. And here's something that might surprise you. Most cowboys couldn't even afford their own horses. The horses belonged to the trail boss or the ranch owner. Cowboys were assigned mounts from the remuda, a herd of spare horses managed by the wrangler. This wasn't just about economics, it was about control. A cowboy who owned his horse could abandon the drive at any time, leaving the crew shorthanded when lives depended on full teamwork. Now, if you're wondering why this teamwork was so crucial, the answer lies in understanding what was trying to kill them every single day. Y'all, history reports say you're responsible for moving 2,500 massive, semi-wild longhorn cattle across 600 miles of open range with no roads, no GPS, and death lurking around every bend. How do you organize such an operation? The answer was a crew structure so sophisticated that it remained virtually unchanged for decades. At the top sat the trail boss. Think of him as both military commander and CEO. He planned the route, made life or death decisions about river crossings and weather, hired and fired crew members, and handled all financial matters. His word was absolute law, because hesitation or debate could mean disaster. But the trail boss couldn't be everywhere at once. That's where the specialized positions came in, each one critical to survival. At the front of the herd rode the point men, the most experienced cowboys who guided the entire operation. They controlled the lead steer, set the pace, and essentially steered thousands of cattle like a massive, dangerous ship. These weren't just skilled riders. They were reading the landscape, anticipating problems, and making split-second decisions that affected everyone behind them. On either side of the herd, about a third of the way back, rode the swing riders. Their job was deceptively simple: keep the herd together. But when a steer decided to break away, these men had seconds to react before the entire herd followed. A single cow escaping could trigger a chain reaction that scattered the whole drive across miles of territory. Further back rode the flank riders, supporting the swing riders and preventing the herd from spreading too wide. And at the very rear came the drag riders, usually the newest, least experienced cowboys who got the worst job. They pushed the slow animals forward while eating dust kicked up by thousands of hooves. It was miserable work, but absolutely essential. And yes, there's a twist coming you probably didn't expect. The most important person on the entire drive wasn't even armed. The cook, affectionately called Cookie, was the crew's lifeline. He drove the chuck wagon, prepared every meal, served as the crew's doctor, barber, and often mediator in disputes. Cookie was so vital that he typically earned $60 per month, double what most cowboys made. Why was the cook so crucial? Because morale was survival. A crew that couldn't work together would die together. The chuck wagon became the heart of the operation, the place where bonds were forged and conflicts resolved around the campfire each night. Then there was the wrangler, usually a young man responsible for the remuda, the herd of spare horses. Each cowboy needed multiple horses because the work was too hard for a single animal. The wrangler made sure fresh mounts were ready at dawn, noon, and evening, and that injured horses received care. Without healthy horses, the crew was stranded. But even with all these roles filled, the dangers weren't over when the sun went down. Now comes the part that explains why cowboys lived in constant fear of being alone. The deadly trinity of stampedes, rustlers, and an environment that seemed designed to kill them. Let's start with stampedes, the nightmare that haunted every cowboy's sleep. Picture 2x500 longhorn cattle, each weighing up to a ton, suddenly panicking and charging through the darkness. The sound was described as thunder that shook the earth, and once it started, stopping it required coordinated action from multiple riders who had to mount their horses and chase a terrified herd through pitch-black terrain. What caused stampedes? Almost anything. A snake startling a calf, thunder, a cowboy carelessly lighting a match, or most terrifyingly, rustlers deliberately spooking the herd to steal cattle in the chaos. George Duffield, a real trail boss, wrote in his diary, "Big thunderstorm last night, stampede, lost 100 beeves hunted all day, found 50, all tired, everything discouraging." Here's the crucial point. Stopping a stampede required precise teamwork. Point riders had to get ahead of the herd and turn the lead animals in a circle, while other riders flanked the sides to prevent further scattering. A single cowboy facing a stampede alone was simply trampled to death. But stampedes weren't even the worst threat. Rustlers were. These weren't the romanticized outlaws of Hollywood. They were organized criminals who targeted cattle drives specifically because they knew the crews were small and isolated. Charles Goodnight described fighting off rustlers. "His Mexicans ran into me with their knives, and would no doubt have done me much harm had it not been for one of my men, Holloway's, who fell into the bunch with his 6-shooter and stood them off." The rustlers' tactics were calculated and deadly. They would follow drives for days, learning the crew's routines and waiting for the perfect moment, usually during storms when tracks would be washed away. They'd spook the cattle, cut off the led steers in the confusion, and disappear with hundreds of animals worth thousands of dollars. Most people overlook this, but once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Every defense against rustlers required multiple men working in coordination. Night herders rode in pairs, circling the herd in opposite directions. Communication happened through hand signals adapted from Plains Indian Sign Language, because voices could carry too far in the stillness. Even the environment itself demanded teamwork for survival. River crossings were particularly deadly. Cattle often refused to enter the water and had to be forced across by riders positioned at specific points. One man alone couldn't generate enough pressure to move a herd across a swollen river. Cowboys described watching helplessly as cattle exhausted themselves in deep water and drowned. The weather was equally merciless. Dust storms could separate a rider from his crew in minutes, and without the group's collective knowledge of navigation, he'd be lost in territory so vast that his bones might never be found. Winter brought different dangers, blizzards that could freeze a man to death if he couldn't find the warmth and shelter of his crew. Then there were the predators, both animal and human. Wolves, bears, and mountain lions prowled the edges of cattle drives, looking for opportunities. Native American tribes sometimes demanded payment for passage through their territory, and negotiations required the authority and numbers of the full crew. But the real revelation about why cowboys couldn't work alone comes from understanding who these men actually were, and it shatters another fundamental myth about the American West. Here's a fact that will probably shock you. 1 out of every 4 cowboys was African American. Between 20 to 25% of cowboys in the American West were black men, yet Hollywood has erased them from nearly every Western ever made. This wasn't just about numbers, it was about survival skills that often kept entire crews alive. Take Bill Pickett, born in 1870 to a former slave. Pickett invented bulldogging, the technique of wrestling steers to the ground that became a standard rodeo event. But more importantly for our story, Pickett and thousands of other black cowboys brought skills learned from slavery, animal handling, tracking, and survival techniques that made them invaluable crew members. The real story gets even more complex. Mexican vaqueros were the original cowboys. They'd been herding cattle on horseback for centuries before American cowboys even existed. The word cowboy itself is a direct translation of vaquero, meaning cowman. These Mexican horsemen taught Americans virtually every technique that became associated with cowboy culture: roping, branding, the equipment, even the clothing. Native Americans also played crucial roles as cowboys. They were recognized for their superior horseback riding skills. Comanche warriors could shoot arrows from under a horse's neck at full gallop, while the Crow people took pride in their bronco riding abilities. Spanish missionaries had actually trained Native Americans as cattle herders from the early 1700s, making them some of the most experienced horsemen on the frontier. Why does this diversity matter for understanding why cowboys worked in teams? Because survival on the frontier required every possible skill and knowledge base. A crew might include a Mexican vaquero who knew how to read weather patterns, an African-American cowboy who understood animal behavior, a Native American who could track lost cattle, and white settlers who handled the business side. This wasn't some idealistic multicultural fantasy. It was economic necessity. Ranch owners like Richard King actually traveled to Mexico in 1854 to recruit entire vaquero families because their skills were superior to anything available locally. The diversity wasn't accidental. It was strategic survival planning. But here's what's really remarkable. The trail created bonds across racial lines that were rare anywhere else in 19th century America. When your life depended on the man next to you, skin color became secondary to competence and loyalty. Cowboys described forming lifelong friendships on the trail that transcended the social barriers of their time. The chuck wagon became a symbol of this forced equality. Everyone ate the same food, slept under the same stars, and faced the same dangers. Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving's famous partnership exemplified this when Loving was wounded by rustlers. Goodnight risked his own life to recover his friend's body, demonstrating the deep bonds of what he called cowboy brotherhood. However, this cooperation had its limits, and when teamwork failed, the consequences were swift and deadly. Take the case documented by trail boss George Duffield in 1866. His crew lost coordination during a series of stampedes, and the results were catastrophic. May 1st traveled 10 miles to Coriel Cobig stamped, lost 200 head of cattle. Second spent the day hunting and found but 25 head. It has been raining for 3 days. These are dark days for me. The psychological toll was evident in his increasingly desperate diary entries as the drive fell apart. The psychology of isolation was well documented by cowboys themselves. Kansas journalist Henry King, who interviewed hundreds of trail riders, noted that the repetitious chores and vast emptiness caused cowboys to feel adrift on these great, vague, and melancholy prairies. One cowboy complained that the trip that was once so exciting and thick with adventure has come to be an unspeakably cheerless and tiresome thing. But isolation wasn't just psychologically devastating, it was practically deadly. Cowboys who became separated from their crews faced what they called the silence, a psychological condition where the vastness and emptiness of the prairie drove men to madness. Some began talking to their horses or to themselves. Others simply sat down and waited to die. The chuck wagon served as more than just a mobile kitchen. It was the psychological anchor that kept crews sane. Cookie wasn't just preparing meals. He was maintaining morale through the most basic human need, communal dining. Men who might spend all day isolated with only cattle for company could reconnect with humanity around the campfire each evening. The night watch system reveals just how seriously cowboys took the threat of isolation. Night herders always worked in pairs, never alone, riding in opposite directions around the bedded herd. They sang softly to keep the cattle calm and to keep each other company through the dark hours when fear and loneliness could overwhelm a man. When this system failed, disasters followed. Cowboys described finding crew members who had simply vanished during the night. Sometimes they'd ridden off in pursuit of strays and never returned. The vastness of the range could swallow a man so completely that search parties might never find even his bones. The most telling evidence comes from the few accounts of cowboys who attempted to work alone. These stories invariably ended in death or rescue by passing crews. One survivor described being found after 3 days alone. I was talking to the sky, to the ground, to the cattle. The silence was eating me alive from the inside. River crossings provided the clearest examples of why teamwork was non-negotiable. A single cowboy might face a herd that refused to enter the water, and without backup, he had no way to generate the pressure needed to force the crossing. Cowboys described watching helplessly as cattle milled at river edges for hours, while precious time and daylight disappeared. Even more dangerous were injured cowboys. A man thrown from his horse or kicked by a steer needed immediate help, not just for medical care, but for basic survival. The cook often served as the crew's doctor, setting bones and treating wounds with whatever supplies were available. a cowboy injured while alone would simply die. We'll come back to that, but first, let me show you the most shocking truth about why the lone cowboy myth exists at all. So why does the myth of the lone cowboy persist when the reality was so different? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about how America chose to remember its own history. Hollywood amplified this mythology exponentially. The film industry found that lone heroes made for better storytelling than complex crew dynamics. John Ford, the legendary Western director, even acknowledged this problem in 1962 with a famous line from The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance: "When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." There was a darker reason for promoting the lone cowboy myth. It erased the diverse reality of the West. By focusing on solitary white heroes, Hollywood could ignore the fact that 1/4 of cowboys were African American. Many others were Mexican vaqueros, and Native Americans played crucial roles. The myth of the lone cowboy became a tool for rewriting history to match racial preferences. The myth also served emerging corporate interests. By the early 20th century, America was becoming increasingly industrialized and urbanized. The lone cowboy represented an escape from the growing reality that success required cooperation, unions, and collective action. Ironically, promoting individualism helped distract from the collective power that workers were beginning to discover. Consider this: the real cowboys actually went on strike. In 1883, hundreds of cowboys in Texas organized for better pay and working conditions. These supposedly individualistic heroes formed what was essentially a labor union, because they understood that collective action was more powerful than individual effort. The erasure was so complete that most Americans today don't know that Bass Reeves, a black U.S. Marshal, was likely the real-life inspiration for the Lone Ranger, or that Nat Love, known as Deadwood Dick, was the expert marksman who inspired many of the cowboys on TV and in movies. Hollywood literally whitewashed the heroes while keeping their stories. The chuckwagon conversations around evening campfires weren't just about passing time, they were about building the trust and communication that would keep everyone alive the next day. The specialized positions weren't just about efficiency, they were about creating a system where every person's contribution was essential to everyone's survival. When we strip away the Hollywood myths and examine the historical record, we find that the American West was actually built on cooperation, not competition, on mutual dependence, not independence, on collective action, not individual heroism. The cowboys who really shaped the frontier understood something that the mythmakers forgot. In a world where death was always watching, working alone wasn't brave, it was stupid. The smart money was always on the crew. So the next time you see a lone cowboy riding into the sunset on screen, remember the truth hidden behind the myth. Those men rode together, worked together, and survived together, because in the real Wild West, the only way to stay alive was to make sure nobody rode alone. Subscribe to The Harsh West for the best Wild West and history content